The dust never truly settled in Millfield Creek. It hung in the air like unspoken secrets, coating everything from the weathered wooden storefronts to the dreams of its 347 residents. The town had sprouted up around the railroad depot in 1878, and now, 5 years later, it carried the particular rhythm of a place caught between wilderness and civilization. On this September morning in 1883, the air carried the scent of fresh bread from Widow Patterson's bakery and the metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge. Sarah Beth Morrison adjusted her pale blue dress for the 100th time, her fingers trembling as she smoothed the fabric her mother had spent months sewing by lamplight. At 19, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that made people pause. Dark hair that caught copper highlights in the sun, grey eyes that held both intelligence and kindness, and a smile that had once made the whole town feel lighter. Today, that smile was nowhere to be found. "You look beautiful, dear heart," her mother, Ellen Morrison, whispered, adjusting Sarah Beth's lace collar. The Morrison family had arrived in Millfield Creek 3 years ago, when Ellen's husband took work at the grain mill. They'd built a modest life in their small house on Oak Street, where Ellen took in sewing and Sarah Beth helped at the general store. "I feel like I might be sick, Mama," Sarah Beth confessed, pressing a hand to her stomach. Through the window, she could see people gathering in the town square for the morning ceremony, the official blessing of her engagement to Thomas Hartwell, the banker's son. The engagement itself had been a practical arrangement. Thomas was steady, educated, and came from one of Millfield Creek's most respected families. Sarah Beth had agreed because it seemed like the sensible thing to do, the path that would secure her family's future. But standing there in her best dress, she felt like she was preparing for her own funeral. "Marriage ain't about butterflies in your stomach, child," Ellen said, though her voice held a note of uncertainty. "It's about partnership, security, building something together." Sarah Beth nodded, knowing her mother was right but unable to shake the feeling that something vital was missing from this equation. The church bell chimed 9 o'clock, and Ellen squeezed her daughter's shoulders. "Time to go, sweetheart." They walked the 3 blocks to the town square, where a small crowd had gathered around the gazebo. Thomas stood waiting in his Sunday best, his brown hair slicked back with pomade, his expression serious and proper. His father, Banker Hartwell, stood beside him wearing an expression of satisfied approval. Sheriff Marcus Dalton commanded attention, even when he wasn't trying. At 42, he was a man carved from the harsh realities of frontier life, broad shoulders, steel grey eyes, and hands that bore the calluses of someone who'd never known an easy day. He'd kept the peace in Millfield Creek for 8 years, and his word carried the weight of law in a place where law sometimes bent to necessity. "Folks," Sheriff Dalton called out, his voice carrying across the square, "we're gathered here this morning to witness the engagement blessing of Thomas Hartwell and Miss Sarah Beth Morrison." Sarah Beth felt every eye upon her as she walked forward, her mother's hand gentle on her back. The faces in the crowd were familiar: Mrs. Chen from the laundry, old Pete from the hardware store, the Kowalski family who ran the restaurant. These were people who'd watched her grow up, who'd known her as the girl who always had a kind word and helped anyone in need. Pastor Reynolds stepped forward with his worn Bible, beginning the traditional blessing. But as he spoke, Sarah Beth became increasingly aware of the way some of the men in the crowd were looking at her. There was Jake Brennan, who'd been drinking since dawn despite the early hour. There was Charlie Ross, whose wife had died the previous winter, and who'd made increasingly uncomfortable comments whenever Sarah Beth served him at the general store. The worst was the way they looked at her, not with respect or even simple appreciation, but with a hunger that made her skin crawl. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to focus on Pastor Reynolds's words. "Sarah Beth Morrison," the pastor was saying, "do you accept this blessing of engagement to Thomas Hartwell?" She began, but her words were interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the crowd. "Well, ain't she something to behold?" Jake Brennan called out, swaying slightly on his feet. "Thomas, you sure are a lucky man getting to marry all that temptation." The word hung in the air like a slap. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Sarah Beth felt heat flood her cheeks. Thomas stiffened beside her, his jaw clenching. "That's enough, Jake," Sheriff Dalton's voice cut through the murmurs. But instead of addressing Brennan's inappropriate comment, the sheriff's steel-grey eyes fixed on Sarah Beth with an expression that made her blood run cold. "You know what?" Sheriff Dalton said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. "Maybe Jake's got a point. Maybe we ought to think about what kind of influence a young woman can have on the moral character of a town. Sarah Beth felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Sheriff Dalton, Now I ain't saying it's intentional, Dalton continued, his tone taking on the authority he used when addressing criminals. But when a woman dresses herself up, puts herself on display like this, well, it's bound to stir up certain feelings in the menfolk, feelings that can lead to trouble. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Sarah Beth could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Her mother's hand found her arm, gripping tight. "Sheriff," Pastor Reynolds said carefully, "perhaps we should—" "I'm just saying what needs to be said," Dalton interrupted. "A woman has responsibilities to her community, and when she goes around looking like temptation itself, she's got to understand that she bears some responsibility for the effect she has on others." The word hit Sarah Beth like a physical blow. Temptation. He'd called her temptation, as if her very existence was somehow corrupting the moral fiber of their town, as if the inappropriate looks and comments she'd endured were her fault, simply because she existed as a young woman. Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sheriff, I'm sure Sarah Beth didn't intend—" "Course she didn't intend," Dalton said with a dismissive wave. "But intention ain't everything, is it? Sometimes a woman needs to be reminded of her place, of her responsibilities to the community that's welcomed her family." Sarah Beth found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "I've done nothing wrong, Sheriff Dalton. Haven't you?" His eyes raked over her dress, her carefully arranged hair, her trembling hands. "You stand there in that dress with that face, and you tell me you haven't stirred up desires in half the men in this square. You tell me you're not responsible for the thoughts you put in their heads." The injustice of it stole her breath. She was being blamed for existing, for being young and female in a world where apparently those things alone made her guilty of corrupting others. "I think," Thomas said, his voice carefully controlled, "perhaps we should continue this ceremony another day. When tempers have cooled." Even her fiancé was distancing himself from her, Sarah Beth realized. Even he believed, on some level, that she was somehow at fault. "That might be wise," Sheriff Dalton agreed, nodding approvingly at Thomas. "Give the young lady time to consider her responsibilities to this community." Sarah Beth looked around the square at the faces of people she'd known for years. Some looked uncomfortable, others nodded in agreement with the sheriff, but no one spoke up for her. No one challenged his words or defended her character. Her mother tugged gently on her arm. "Come on, dear heart," Ellen whispered. "Let's go home." Sarah Beth allowed herself to be led away, her head held high despite the tears burning behind her eyes. As they walked back toward Oak Street, she could hear the murmurs starting behind them, the way her name was already becoming associated with the sheriff's damning word, temptation. By nightfall, it would be all over town. The girl who'd been publicly shamed by the sheriff, blamed for the very desires she inspired in others, reduced to a single damning word that would follow her like a shadow. But Sarah Beth Morrison, walking home in her pale blue dress with her dignity intact, if not her reputation, had no idea that her humiliation would plant a seed that would grow into something Sheriff Dalton never saw coming. The news traveled through Millfield Creek like wildfire in dry grass. By sunset, there wasn't a soul in town who hadn't heard about Sheriff Dalton calling Sarah Beth Morrison temptation right there in the town square, in front of God and everybody. At the Morrison house on Oak Street, Sarah Beth sat by her bedroom window, still wearing the pale blue dress that had somehow become evidence of her supposed moral failing. She hadn't spoken since they'd returned home, hadn't touched the tea her mother had brought, hadn't responded to Thomas's awkward visit where he'd suggested they wait for things to settle down before setting a new date for their engagement blessing. "Dear heart," Ellen Morrison said softly, settling onto the edge of the bed. "You can't sit there forever, can't I?" Sarah Beth's voice was barely a whisper. "Seems like that's what everyone expects. For me to hide away like I've done something shameful." Ellen's hands twisted in her apron. She'd been married for 23 years, had raised 2 daughters, and buried 1 son. She'd seen enough of the world to know that men often blamed women for their own shortcomings, but she'd never seen it done so publicly, so cruelly. Maybe if you wore something more modest tomorrow, something with a higher neckline." "Mama?" Sarah Beth turned from the window, and Ellen was startled by the steel in her daughter's grey eyes. "This dress covers me from wrist to ankle. There's nothing immodest about it. There's nothing immodest about me. I know that, sweetheart. Then why are you asking me to change? Ellen fell silent, unable to answer, because the truth was too uncomfortable. She was asking her daughter to change because it was easier than challenging the sheriff, easier than standing up to a town that had decided Sarah Beth was somehow responsible for men's inability to control their thoughts. 3 blocks away, in the kitchen of the boarding house she ran, Martha Chen was dealing with her own uncomfortable truth. At 55, she'd come to America from Guangdong province with her husband 20 years ago. They'd worked the railroad, saved every penny, and finally bought this boarding house when the town was still young enough to welcome Chinese settlers. Now, as she prepared dinner for her boarders, she couldn't stop thinking about the look in Sarah Beth's eyes as she'd walked away from the town square. "Mrs. Chen," called Jim Patterson, one of her regulars, as he entered the dining room. "Did you hear what happened at the engagement ceremony? Sheriff really put that Morrison girl in her place." Martha's hands stilled on the pot she was stirring. Put her in her place? Called her temptation right in front of everyone. About time someone said what we were all thinking. Girl's been flaunting herself around town for months. The wooden spoon cracked in Martha's grip. She thought of her own daughter, lost to fever 3 years ago at age 17. She thought of the way men in this town looked at young women, the way they talked about them when they thought no one was listening. "Mr. Patterson," she said carefully, her English still accented after all these years, "what exactly was Miss Morrison doing that was flaunting?" "Well, Patterson stopped, seeming to realize he couldn't actually name anything specific. "She's just, you know how these young women are. The way they dress, the way they carry themselves. It gives men ideas. Ideas that are her responsibility." Patterson looked uncomfortable. "Well, no, but a decent woman knows how to conduct herself so as not to tempt others into sin." Martha turned back to her cooking, but her mind was racing. She'd heard these same arguments used against Chinese women when white men pursued them. It was always the woman's fault, always her responsibility to manage men's desires and impulses. Across town, in the neat house behind the schoolhouse, Emily Rodriguez was marking arithmetic papers by lamplight. At 31, she was one of the few unmarried women in Millfield Creek who wasn't considered a spinster or a burden. She'd been the town's school teacher for 6 years, ever since arriving from Santa Fe with impeccable credentials and a determination to educate frontier children. But even her position hadn't protected her from whispers when she'd refused advances from several local men, including the sheriff himself 2 years ago. A knock at her door interrupted her grading. She opened it to find Mary O'Sullivan, the doctor's wife, standing on her porch with red-rimmed eyes. "Emily, I need to talk to someone, and I thought, well, you're the only woman I know who isn't afraid to speak her mind." Emily invited her in, noting how Mary's hands shook as she accepted a cup of coffee. "It's about what happened today," Mary began, "with Sarah Beth Morrison. I heard," Emily's voice was carefully neutral, "my husband came home furious. Not at the sheriff, mind you, but at Sarah Beth. Said she was disrupting the moral order of the town. Said decent women should know better than to inspire such thoughts in men." Mary's voice broke on the last words. Emily waited, recognizing the signs of a woman carrying a burden she'd never spoken aloud. 5 years ago," Mary continued, her voice barely audible, "when I was still new to town, I was walking home from Mrs. Patterson's shop. Jake Brennan, the same one who made those awful comments today, he cornered me in the alley behind the bank. He tried to force himself on me." Emily's blood ran cold, but she remained still, letting Mary speak. "I fought him off, ran home crying. When I told my husband, you know what he said?" Mary's laugh was bitter. "He asked me what I'd done to encourage Jake's attention, asked if I'd been too friendly, smiled too much, worn something too inviting." The weight of Mary's confession settled between them like a stone. "I never told anyone else," Mary whispered. "I was so ashamed. But today, watching that poor girl being blamed for existing, for being young and pretty, I realized I wasn't ashamed of what Jake tried to do. I was ashamed that my own husband blamed me for it." Emily reached across the table and took Mary's hand. "You weren't responsible for Jake's actions. You're not responsible for any man's inability to control himself. Then why does everyone act like we are?" It was a question Emily had been asking herself for years, ever since she'd realized that her education, her independence, her very existence as a woman who didn't need a man to define her worth, made some people deeply uncomfortable. Meanwhile, in the sheriff's office, Marcus Dalton sat at his desk, filling out paperwork and feeling satisfied with the day's work. He'd sent a clear message to the women of Millfield Creek about appropriate behavior, about knowing their place in the community's moral order. He didn't see the group of women gathering in Martha Chen's boarding house dining room after the evening meal. Didn't know that Emily Rodriguez had left her schoolhouse and was walking through the darkened streets, stopping at house after house. Didn't realize that his public shaming of Sarah Beth Morrison had done something he never intended. It had given the women of Millfield Creek a shared language for experiences they'd carried in silence. By midnight, 12 women had gathered in Martha's dining room. The oldest was Grandmother Kowalski, who'd survived the journey from Poland and raised 7 children in this harsh land. The youngest was barely 18, a new bride whose husband had already begun commenting on how she needed to learn proper wifely submission. They sat in Martha's dining room, sharing stories they'd never told before. Stories of being blamed for men's wandering eyes, their unwanted advances, their failures of character. Stories of being told they were responsible for others' actions simply because they existed as women. Sarah Beth Morrison slept fitfully in her childhood bed, unaware that her humiliation was transforming into something larger. She didn't know that across town, women were speaking truths they'd kept buried, were recognizing their shared experiences of blame and shame. She didn't know that by morning, the seed Sheriff Dalton had planted with his cruel words would begin to sprout into something that would change Millfield Creek forever. The last thing Martha Chen did before retiring for the night was to pull out a piece of paper and begin writing. Her English might be imperfect, but her message was clear. No woman should face shame alone. Tomorrow we stand together. She folded the note carefully, knowing that by dawn copies would be in the hands of every woman in town who had ever been called temptation, blamed for men's desires, or made to feel responsible for others' moral failures. The reckoning Sheriff Dalton had invited was coming, though not in the way he'd intended. Dawn came to Millfield Creek with unusual stillness. Sarah Beth Morrison found her mother standing at the kitchen stove, shoulders rigid with tension. "Mama?" Sarah Beth called softly. "You're up early." Ellen Morrison turned, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something that looked like anger. On the table lay a folded piece of paper. "Sarah Beth, I need to tell you something." Ellen's voice was stronger than it had been in years. "It's about yesterday, and about 23 years of watching good women be blamed for men's failures." She picked up the paper. "Martha Chen brought this before sunrise. It seems I'm not the only mother in this town who's had enough." Across town, women had been gathering at Emily Rodriguez's schoolhouse since 5 o'clock. Martha Chen arrived carrying her boarding house sign, the symbol of her independence and capability. "Are we certain about this?" asked Margaret Thompson, the banker's wife. "What if Sheriff Dalton arrests us?" "For what?" Emily's voice was calm but firm. "For standing in a public square." Mary O'Sullivan entered with her medical bag. "I've been thinking all night about what Jake Brennan tried to do to me, about how my own husband blamed me for it. I'm done carrying that shame. It was never mine to carry." One by one, they shared what they would carry. Grandmother Kowalski held her late husband's hammer, proof she could do men's work. Young Anna Peterson carried her school books, evidence of the education she'd fought for, despite being told learning would make her unmarriageable. Sarah Beth read Martha Chen's note with growing amazement. "Yesterday one of us was shamed for existing as a woman. Today we choose to exist together, without apology. If you have ever been called temptation, blamed for men's failures, told to make yourself smaller, join us at 9 o'clock. Bring something that represents your strength, your refusal to accept shame that was never yours." "How many women received this?" Sarah Beth whispered. Ellen's smile was fierce. "Every woman in Millfield Creek, dear heart. Every single one." At 8:30, Sheriff Dalton was enjoying his morning coffee when Deputy Williams burst in, pale and confused. "Sheriff, you need to see the town square. There's women, a lot of women." Dalton stepped outside and felt his blood run cold. Dozens upon dozens of women stood shoulder to shoulder in perfect silence, from teenage girls to elderly grandmothers, arranged in neat rows facing the gazebo where he delivered his judgment. Each held something in her hands: Martha Chen's boarding house sign, Emily Rodriguez's slate board, Mary O'Sullivan's medical bag, Grandmother Kowalski's hammer, Ellen Morrison's sewing basket. "Near as I can count, sir," Deputy Williams said quietly, "close to 300. 300 women. Nearly every woman in Millfield Creek standing in absolute silence, their presence more powerful than any shouted protest. In the center of the front row stood Sarah Beth Morrison. She wore the same pale blue dress, but her posture was entirely different. Gone was the hunched shame. She stood tall, dignified, unafraid. In her hands, she held a simple white handkerchief, the one she'd used to dry her tears the previous evening. These women had brought the tools of their trades, the evidence of their capabilities, the symbols of their contributions to the community that had shamed one of them for existing. Sheriff Dalton felt cold sweat break across his forehead. This was not the submission he'd expected. This challenged the very foundation of the order he'd tried to maintain. "Sheriff?" Deputy Williams asked nervously. "What do we do?" Dalton stared at the sea of faces, searching for anger or hysteria, something he could label as unseemly behavior, but all he found was dignity, solidarity, and quiet strength that drew power from unity. He opened his mouth to demand they disperse, but the words died as he met Sarah Beth Morrison's steady grey eyes. She was no longer the frightened girl from yesterday. She was something new, and she was not alone. The standoff lasted 17 minutes. Sheriff Marcus Dalton stood facing 300 women who had transformed his orderly town into something unrecognizable. The silence stretched until Grandmother Kowalski stepped forward, her weathered hands gripping her late husband's hammer. At 73, she'd survived an ocean crossing, buried a husband and 3 children, and built a life from nothing. Her voice carried hard-earned authority. "I came to this country with nothing but hope and strong hands," she said, her accented English clear in the morning air. "I raised 7 children, built 3 houses, buried the people I loved most. In all those years, never once was I called temptation for simply existing." She took another step forward, and Dalton found himself stepping back. "Yesterday, you shamed a girl for the crime of being young and female. Today, you see what happens when you shame one of us." She gestured to the sea of women behind her. "We are the mothers who raised your children, the wives who built your homes, the daughters who will inherit this town. We are not temptation. We are not responsible for men's failures of character." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "We are human beings, deserving of respect, not shame." Dr. O'Sullivan pushed through the crowd, his face pale. He found his wife Mary in the front row, holding her medical bag with steady hands. For 5 years, he had questioned her account of Jake Brennan's assault. Now, seeing her dignity alongside women from every walk of life, he understood his failure. "Mary," he called out, his voice cracking, "I owe you an apology." Mary met her husband's eyes across the space between them. "Yes," she said simply, "you do." Thomas Hartwell appeared at the square's edge, disheveled. He'd spent the night wrestling with his cowardice. When Sarah Beth was shamed publicly, he'd worried more about reputation than defending the woman he claimed to love. "Sarah Beth," he called out, stepping forward despite his father's restraining hand, "I should have defended you yesterday. I should have told Sheriff Dalton you were being blamed for something that was never your fault. I was a coward and I'm sorry." Sarah Beth studied his face. "Thank you for saying that, Thomas, but an apology doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't change what I learned about myself." She looked around the square. "Yesterday I thought I needed someone else to define my worth, but standing here with these women, I realize I was wrong. My worth isn't dependent on anyone's opinion of me." She stepped toward Thomas, her voice gentle but firm. "I won't marry a man who needs me to be smaller so he can feel bigger. I won't build a life with someone who sees my strength as a threat." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand, and I think you're right to expect more." Sheriff Dalton watched this exchange with growing unease. The demonstration was accomplishing exactly what he'd feared. It was giving the women of his town ideas about their own worth, their own power. But as he looked at the faces surrounding him, he began to realize that his authority had been built on something far more fragile than he'd understood. Pastor Reynolds approached him carefully. "Sheriff, perhaps it's time to address what happened yesterday." Dalton's jaw clenched. "What happened yesterday was necessary to maintain order." "What happened yesterday," interrupted Martha Chen, her voice carrying clearly across the square, "was a powerful man blaming a powerless woman for his own discomfort with her existence." She stepped forward to join Grandmother Kowalski. "In my country, I saw what happens when people are blamed for others' actions, when they are made responsible for things beyond their control. It always starts with those who have the least power. Women, immigrants, the poor." Her eyes met Dalton's steadily. But it never ends there, Sheriff. Once a community accepts that some people can be shamed for existing, it becomes easier to find new groups to blame, new people to make responsible for others' failures. Emily Rodriguez joined them, her teacher's voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Sheriff Dalton, you have a choice to make," she said. "You can continue to defend yesterday's actions, which would tell every girl in this town that her worth is determined by men's ability to control their thoughts about her, or you can acknowledge that you were wrong and help us build a community where women are treated with the same dignity and respect as men." The pressure of 300 pairs of eyes, of an entire community watching and waiting, settled on Dalton's shoulders like a crushing weight. He thought of his own sister, dead these 10 years, who had been blamed by their father for inspiring inappropriate attention from men in their hometown. He thought of the countless times he'd seen women accept blame for men's behavior because it was easier than challenging the system that kept everyone in their assigned places. For the first time in his adult life, Sheriff Marcus Dalton felt the full weight of his own moral choices. He began, his voice hoarse. The words seemed to stick in his throat. 8 years of unexamined assumptions and unquestioned authority, making it almost impossible to speak. But then he looked at Sarah Beth Morrison, standing tall and unashamed in her blue dress, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words carrying across the silent square. "Miss Morrison, I was wrong to blame you for others' behavior. I was wrong to shame you publicly, and I apologize." The admission seemed to break something open in the morning air. Women began to lower their symbolic objects, though they remained standing in their formation. Men in the crowd shifted and murmured, some nodding in approval, others looking uncomfortable with this public display of female solidarity. Sarah Beth stepped forward, and for a moment it seemed she might accept Dalton's apology with gracious forgiveness. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. "Sheriff Dalton," she said, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't existed 2 days ago, "your apology is a start, but words aren't enough anymore. If you truly believe that women deserve dignity and respect, then I expect to see that belief reflected in how you handle similar situations in the future." She gestured to the women around her. "We'll be watching, all of us." It was not a threat, but it was a promise. The women of Millfield Creek would no longer suffer in silence when one of them was mistreated. They would no longer accept blame for others' moral failures. They had found their voices, their strength, their power in unity. Over the following months, that September morning's effects rippled through Millfield Creek. Sarah Beth used her wedding savings to purchase the old newspaper office, publishing the Millfield Creek Women's Gazette. Emily Rodriguez expanded the school curriculum for girls. Mary O'Sullivan began openly assisting her husband and eventually studied nursing in Denver. Martha Chen's boarding house became a gathering place for women throughout the region. Sheriff Dalton began the slow work of examining his assumptions about power and justice. The town square returned to its normal rhythms, but something fundamental had changed in Millfield Creek. The women who had stood together on that September morning had proven that solidarity could transform shame into strength, that speaking truth together was more powerful than suffering in silence. They had learned that they were not temptation to be controlled, but human beings deserving of respect. And once that lesson took root, it grew into something that would outlast all of them, a legacy of dignity that would be passed down to daughters and granddaughters, ensuring that no woman in Millfield Creek would ever again have to face humiliation alone. The frontier had always been a place where people created new ways of living. On that September morning in 1883, the women of Millfield Creek had created something revolutionary, a community where a woman's worth was determined by her character, not by others' ability to control their thoughts about her. It was, Sarah Beth Morrison would write years later in her newspaper, the beginning of everything.